And this week, God's been speaking to me. It came up in Sabbath school a little earlier about the negativity we see in our world. Have you guys ever felt yourself getting a sense of discontentment? Are you prone to grumble or complain? With social media, it's easier than ever, right? To just vent your frustrations, to share what's going on. Any little frustration in your life, we can vent about on a public platform. I know that I'm prone to this. My generation especially is we're the social media generation, me and the younger ones, right? So we learn to live our life publicly, venting whatever we want. Complaining publicly gives us attention when we're not feeling well, right? It gives us that kind of pity party that we all kind of like deep down. We don't want to admit it, but that's why we do it, right? And I'm sure we all know friends in our lives who like to complain. They're never satisfied with the things they have in life. They have a house that's just painted, but it's not the right color, or the roof doesn't match anymore, or they need a bigger house or a bigger car, or it's not just right. They're always looking to the future. The next thing will make them happy. The next thing, right? They're not content with what they have. There's nothing wrong with desiring something else, but if it's the point where your joy is, now you have a problem, right? It might be that you can't be fully present if you're constantly looking to the future. And if you don't have a friend like that, it might just be you. We often get in this mode of the next thing. It's so easy to fall in that more and more merry-go-round of our society. Our society revolves around that, right? And we can always be dissatisfied with what we have. It's so easy. It's natural. It's normal in today's age to always want better, more, bigger, right? We quite often forget, quite simply, that God is enough. We know it's wrong, and yet it's so easy to find ourselves right there, looking for something else to fill that hole. Though this may seem like something that's unique to our consumer-driven, materialistic society, it is nothing new. It's not. As we'll see today, it's pretty old. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, if you'd like to follow along with me, we're going to be reading out of Numbers 11, 1 through 6. Numbers 11, 1 through 6. I'm going to give you a little background on it as you're turning there. So the book of Numbers really records the 40 years that Israel spent wandering in the desert. It records the time between the end of Exodus, where they arrive at Mount Sinai, and when they enter the land, kind of that 40 years later. And in the preceding chapter, in chapter 10, Israel is celebrating Passover at Sinai. They're getting ready to leave. They're receiving their final instructions from God. God's telling them, when the cloud comes down, you'll put your roots here and you'll stay until I leave, until I depart from amongst you, and then we're going to go out and we're going to march some more. And no matter how long that's for, you'll do it. And they all said, yeah, cool, right? And so they're receiving all those instructions. This is roughly a year after the Exodus. So they've been gone from Egypt for about a year now, camping out. And so that's where we pick up in chapter 11. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard of it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt, that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." So we go from being excited about departing to complaining, right? They're complaining about their misfortunes, it says. It means distress or adversity. They didn't want to be in the desert. This is 3 days away from Sinai, about 3 days north. Now, that doesn't mean how long it took them to get there. That's a normal day's travel. They had lots of people and animals and stuff with them that they were moving all at once, so it could have taken them longer to get there. But they're not that far away from where they just left, and we're excited to depart, right? They just celebrated Passover. They're excited. And here they are. They left the relative abundance of the Sinai mountain out into the desert. And then when I read about it this week, the desert is pretty barren. There's nothing out there. And they didn't want to be there. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They were looking back at what they had. They were saying, well, Egypt wasn't great. We were slaves, but man, this is better than this. We're out in the middle of nowhere. We don't know where we're going. You know, they're not looking forward to the promise that God just gave them over and over again for the last year. Gave to them directly, not just their promise. I mean, they have a heritage of that promise as well, right? And again, that promise goes all the way back to Abraham, right? In the book of Genesis 12:7. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him, right? So God said to Abraham, "I'm going to make a nation out of you. I'm going to make you my people. And they're going to go into Egypt. They're going to be slaves, but I'm going to bring them back here. This is the land I've set aside for you." Right? And then God reaffirms this promise to Moses when he calls him to go to the Pharaoh in Exodus 3. The Lord said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites." So Moses shares that promise with Israel. So they've heard it. God's affirmed it again and again and again to them over this year that he has set aside this land for them. He's going to clear out the people. He's going to bring them into it. All they have to do is follow him. And I think we can a little bit understand where they're coming from. We don't like change, right? Humans don't like to not be in control. We're creatures of habit. And we know that we don't have any control, right? We have very little that we can control in this life, but we love that illusion that we have control in our life, right? So we can sympathize a little bit with them, but you know, God doesn't really give them an out on this. He said, "I've called this, I've promised this to you, and you need to do this." And we know this was sin because God was angry. He sent fire down on the camp, and he didn't just send a little bit of fire. It wasn't like a fireball that consumed a tent. It says that fire came down, and it didn't quit until after Moses interceded on their behalf, right? So God's anger was alleviated by Moses' prayer, not by the people crying out. It wasn't a shot across the bow. It was like, all right, you're going to get this, right? And now, if that doesn't put a fire under your rear to change your attitude, I don't know what will, right? But as we continue on in verse 4, in the next 3 verses, we see that it didn't change their attitude, not one bit. They quickly forgot that. And they got bored with God's provision. Not just that they were in the desert, but his provision for them. As hard as that is to believe. Now, they were complaining that all they had was manna. So the heavenly provision that God's given them for over a year, every day he's provided food for them, sustenance from heaven, and they are longing for fish, onions, leeks, garlic, all the things they had in Egypt. Again, it's about looking backwards, not being appreciative of what they had, because they cried out to God in the desert and said, "You've brought us out here to starve." And God said, "All right, I'm going to provide you some provision," right? And that's where the manna came from. And for those of you, if you don't know what manna was, it literally was bread that came down at night during the dew and was on the morning on the ground. And all they had to do was gather it up. It was exactly enough for each person. Whatever they gathered was exactly what they needed to fill them. And it was like the perfect fulfillment of what they needed every day. Now, I think as Americans, as people who have luxury, we can totally understand, again, where they are coming from. We're not so different from these people, right? We say, man, I cannot imagine eating an onion every day or something. We can understand the monotony of something. I think we all kind of all get that. But again, the Bible is clear that they were wrong and they were rejecting God's promise and provision in their grumbling. Now remember, this is about the people, not individuals, but the people in general. So all of them were kind of in concert on this. So, they're complaining, they're grumbling. God's been providing for them. They're rejecting the promise. They're rejecting the provision. They'd lost their thankfulness. When it first showed up, they were appreciative. They were thankful for the provision that came. But they forgot that God is enough. God delivers. God upholds his promise. God is enough. He's faithful. But I know that I can relate to this attitude that they share. I know that we've all been in a place where we've needed something, wanted something desperately, and we've been given it. I'm sure you can vividly remember the thankfulness you felt when you got it, whether it was a gift or something you needed or whatever in that time, and you were very appreciative about it. But I bet you can also remember the day it became mundane, when you stopped thinking about the appreciativeness that came along with it. I'm sure we all have a time. It's not every time, not every gift comes that way, but we've all experienced that where we've said, well, okay, this is commonplace now, right? We kind of forget the deliverance out of those provisions very quickly. And that's just sinful nature. That's our sinful hearts where it's what have you done for me lately kind of an attitude, unfortunately. And if we read a little further in the passage in verses 19 and 20, we'll see their hearts are revealed. God calls them out right where they're at. And this is in the midst of so they cried out for meat, and God said, all right, I'm going to send you meat because you're crying out to me. So he gave them what they wanted, but it's kind of a judgment at the same time. So he sends a bunch of quail, and it said about 3 feet deep is about how far they came and piled up on the ground. I can't imagine that, but 3 feet deep of birds that came in so that they could eat meat. And this is what it says in verse 19. You shall not eat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? So it wasn't just that they were, upset that they were eating manna. It wasn't just that they wanted to go back to Egypt. It was all of it. They rejected God whose presence was amongst them. I mean, I don't think we can fathom the things they saw, this generation, the signs and wonders that they saw, and yet we see that seeing doesn't necessarily produce faithfulness, right? The signs and wonders that they saw did not make them any more able to obey than if they hadn't seen it. Right? Our sinful hearts dominate us, and they dominate our attitudes, unfortunately. And God is frustrated that they can't just buy into the vision and be obedient. He hasn't asked them to do a lot, just do what I said, right? Go here, follow here, eat this. I'm providing for you, right? And it's this longing backwards instead of buying into the promised future. Like we've been talking about today, about being faithful and having that obedient heart. Well, we might not do it perfect, but we say, okay, God, I'm going to step out where you told me to step out. See, they've neglected to accept that God is enough, that God will see them through it, that God is faithful in his promises. Do we do that today? Do we complain on our situations? Do we focus on the negative? I think we do. I know I have. I know that it's much easier to focus on the negative than the positive sometimes, and the things that you're going to, and then and focus rather on where you're at or where you're coming from, right? Paul in the New Testament speaks to these events that we read about today, and this event is not standalone in Numbers. Numbers is a book of repetitive failures of Israel to faithfully walk in the direction they're told. They grumble the whole time. In fact, the reason they spend 40 years in the desert is because they complained and they were scared and they weren't obedient. So Paul speaks to this in 1 Corinthians 10, in verse 6. He says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." See, their recording, the recording of their repetitive failures is for us to learn that we can trust God. He was faithful. He followed through on the promises, even though they complained, even though they didn't do the right things, even though they suffered the consequences of not doing those things. He still delivered on those promises, right? And those serve as an example for us today. Paul goes so far as to call it idolatry, what they were doing, the complaining, because they rejected the promise and the provision, and they craved the comfort, which was counter to what God had commanded. The elevation of their selfish desires was over top of what God had commanded them. It's like an elevation of self. I know better than God. My way is better. It's idolatry. It's putting somebody else before God. You know? And I don't know about you, but I've been there. Raise your hand if you've been an idolater. I'm just kidding. Don't do it. Because nobody here has ever done that, I'm sure, right? Right? So again, this complaining we're talking about isn't necessarily being frustrated with the challenges in life, the burdens that we feel, right? God tells us we can come to him, we can bring it to the throne, we can share our burdens with him, but that's what he wants. He wants us to come to him. If you notice in the passage, the people are wailing in their tents. They're complaining amongst one another. They're not coming to God. They're not saying, Moses, I don't know about this. They're all getting together in a little huddle over here, and they're saying, this Moses guy, he doesn't really know what he's doing. And God, I don't know. He's not feeding us, and, he just keeps giving us the same thing. It's this stirring up, this complaining in public. It's this public platform that is stirring people up against the desires of what God wants for us. I mean, like I said, God welcomes us to bring our concerns to him. He cares about how we feel, and he wants us to follow him and do that in love and feel good about where we're going with him. He wants to give us comfort. But as we all know, misery loves company. So we like to share our misery, right? The answer to whether it's a private complaint in our heart or if we're suffering from the same problem that the Israelites are, where we complain out loud about everything, about the burdens of where we're at, because we believe that God puts us where we are supposed to be at. He's going to use us where we are. Where we're at is a calling from God, right? And it may be uncomfortable, but that's where we're supposed to be in the moment. So the answer to either one of those is the same. Paul is calling us to live a life that is different from the natural inclinations of our heart, counter to how the world lives their life. We have hope. We have a promise. We have a God that is enough. Paul himself was no stranger to adversity. Before he was a follower of Jesus, he was part of the Sanhedrin. He was a prominent Jew. He was zealous. He was a Roman citizen. He had comforts. But as soon as he became a follower of Jesus, he flipped the tables and he became persecuted by the very people he used to belong to. Though he was a Roman citizen, he was beaten and jailed and not treated as a Roman citizen countless times in his missionary journeys. So he's experienced great times, luxury, comfort, and he's experienced the opposite of that, the hardships and burdens, right? Paul understood that suffering for the promise and understanding God's true provision is it's just adjusting your attitude in those times and trusting that God has it. God has a plan and God is enough. Paul realized that the root of the discontentment, whether it was in the desert or us today, is a lack of faith. It's idolatry. It's putting us above God. It's putting our wants, our needs above what God has already said. This is enough. This is where you're at, and this is where I'm taking you. And Paul shares the solution with us. He said, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have received your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me. He's speaking to the Philippian church. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. God is enough, right? God has called me to this. He will see me through it. That's what he's saying. Again, in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness. If the children want to come up, you can sing as well. If somebody wants to grab the microphone.